Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD bodybuilder, back with another video. Today we're going to be talking about lean versus dirty bulking. I think this is a common question and an important topic to touch on in bodybuilding, since there are a lot of common misconceptions that people have around how quickly they should be gaining weight if they want to maximize muscle growth. Bulking too quickly, or perhaps not quickly enough, is a common mistake people make, and it can cost them gains down the line. Besides actually setting up your training program, deciding the rate at which you want to gain or lose weight is actually one of the most important questions you should be asking yourself, because it dictates what your nutrition plan is going to look like and what you'll be eating. Quick outline: first we're going to be going over our definitions of lean versus dirty bulking. We'll talk about the principles involved that we need to think about if our goal is to build as much muscle as possible. Then we'll talk about lean versus dirty bulking and the pros and cons of each of them. Finally, we'll put all of it together and I'll give you some recommendations on how quickly you should be gaining weight. If that sounds good to you, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and let's get right into it. Okay, so let's start off with some definitions. Lean bulking, you may have heard of this as clean bulking or slow bulking, is what I'll refer to a bulking strategy where you have a slow rate of weight gain, and you usually stick to whole foods. And then dirty bulking, which some people might also describe as a dreamer bulk, is where you have a fast rate of weight gain, and you often use more processed and tasty foods to actually get into that calorie surplus. Now, the problem with the lean versus dirty bulking debate is that there's not a lot of hard, solid evidence to actually tell us the exact rate of weight gain we should be shooting for. So we're gonna have to rely a lot on basic principles in terms of the proportions of muscle and fat gain when we're bulking, as well as the optimal range of body fat percentage we want to be shooting for if we want to maximize our gains. So I did a poll in my YouTube community tab to get a sense of what strategy you guys take in terms of trying to build muscle. And recomping and lean bulking were very popular. So I'll make sure I also touch on the role of body recomposition. All right, so first let's discuss some of the principles that are involved that are going to help us decide how quickly we should be gaining weight. The first really important point is that there's an optimal body fat percentage range for muscle growth. The exact number varies depending on the person, but a general range that I go with is 8 to 15% for males and 18 to 25% for females. When you go below this range of body fat percentage, your body actually experiences a disruption of a lot of hormones, things like testosterone and thyroid, and your body won't be able to build muscle as efficiently as possible. Now, if you go above this body fat percentage range, you also run into problems because there's research showing that obese people are less efficient at building muscle and more likely to just put on more fat. Now, thinking about this optimal body fat percentage range is actually really important when deciding our rate of gain, because it constrains us in terms of how long we're able to bulk for. Let's say you typically fluctuate between a 10 to 15% body fat percentage. If you bulk at a faster rate, you're gonna go from the lower end to the upper end of that range more quickly. And once you get to the upper end of that body fat range, you're gonna wanna cut to get back to the lower end. This is gonna have some implications that affect our decision that we'll talk about in a minute. Now, the next point to think about is that it's harder to gain muscle than it is to lose fat. On a related note, we should also think about the proportion of muscle and fat gain. When you're bulking and you put on muscle, there's always going to be a proportion of fat that you also gain at the same time. However, when you're trying to cut, it's very possible to lose just fat and hold on to your muscle. And this is why bodybuilders actually go for the bulk and cut method, because when you're bulking, you put on some muscle and some fat, and when you cut, you take away the fat, but hold on to the muscle that you've gained. The last point here is that being in a calorie surplus facilitates hypertrophy. Being in a calorie surplus and gaining weight is the best way to make sure your body has all the nutrients available in order to build muscle, and it signals the body that it's a good time to grow. Now, I put an asterisk here because this only applies up to a certain point. That is, there's some maximal rate at which your body is actually able to gain muscle. Okay, so now that we've laid some groundwork in terms of the principles we need to think about, let's talk about our pros and cons of lean versus dirty bulking. Now, the main pro of lean bulking is that you spend a minimal amount of time cutting. As we said, there's an optimal range of body fat percentage, and if you bulk at a slow rate, you're gonna spend more time to get from one end to the other. This means you'll be spending more time bulking. And as we said earlier, there's probably a limit to how much muscle you're actually able to put on at one time. So if you're able to maximize that rate of muscle gain and continue that over a longer period of bulking, you'll end up with more muscle overall. The other pro of the lean bulk is that you visually look better, and that's just because you're putting on body fat at a slower rate. The main argument against the lean bulk is that you might not always actually be in a surplus if you're targeting a very small rate of gain. We'll talk about some actual rates in a minute, but some people will define lean bulking as something like gaining a pound a month. And when you're gaining weight that slowly, it's actually very difficult to track that kind of progress on a scale over time, which means you might spend weeks where you're at maintenance or even in a calorie deficit, and you wouldn't notice this until you've looked back at your numbers over several weeks. So this is going to depend on how precisely you're able to hit a certain calorie surplus. All right, now let's move on to the pros and cons of the dirty bulk. In terms of pros, the main argument for dirty bulking is that it ensures you're capturing all of your muscle gains. As we talked about earlier, being in a calorie surplus signals your body to build muscle. Some people would argue that you want to make sure you have a big calorie surplus so that you're maximizing those muscle gains and you can just lose the fat afterwards. But there are some cons that we need to consider here. The first is that frequent or long cuts are required. Since there's an optimal range of body fat percentage, if you go from one end to the other very quickly, you're going to have to spend more time cutting back down. There are three main reasons why you don't want to spend a lot of time cutting. First of all, diets are painful and they interfere with your regular life. Second of all, you're losing out on time that could be spent bulking and maximizing muscle growth. As we said, being in a calorie surplus is really helpful for the body in terms of building muscle. So it makes sense that we want to maximize the amount of time that we're actually in a surplus rather than cutting. This isn't something that hasn't been really well studied yet, but a lot of people find that they get their best gains when they've been bulking for an extended period of time. If you think about building a skyscraper, that doesn't just go up in 1 or 2 days. There's a lot of infrastructure and elements that need to be put in step by step for you to actually complete the structure. And I think building muscle is similar. You want to stay in a calorie surplus for at least a few months continuously. And you don't want to have to interrupt that with frequent fat loss phases to stay in that optimal body fat percentage range. They've actually done research where they've compared people with a smaller surplus to a very large surplus. And the people taking a very large calorie surplus did not actually gain more muscle. So when you're dirty bulking, a lot of that extra added weight is just going to be fat that you're going to have to lose later. The last drawback of the dirty bulk is that it's unhealthy. Often, to actually get into that large calorie surplus, people turn to more processed and tasty foods to get their calories. These foods tend to contain more unhealthy fats, more sugar, and less nutritional value. I think when approaching bodybuilding, it's important to make it as sustainable as possible, and this includes thinking about health. Okay, so now let's put all of this together to give you some recommendations. I think it's pretty clear at this point that I am against dirty bulking. I would recommend that you aim to gain weight at the minimum rate that still allows you to maximize muscle growth. Since there's an optimal body fat percentage range we want to be operating in, and since there are a number of drawbacks that come with cutting, we want to maximize the amount of time we actually spend in a surplus. Now, the exact rate of bulking is going to depend on your experience level. I'm going to define a beginner as someone who's in their first 1 to 2 years of serious training. An intermediate would be someone who's been training for 2 to 5 years. And an advanced athlete is someone who's been training seriously for more than 5 years. For beginners, I would suggest aiming for 1 to 1.5% of body weight gain per month. To put this into context, if you weigh 200 pounds, 1 to 1.5% would be 2 to 3 pounds per month, which also translates into 0.5 to 0.75 pounds per week. For intermediate to advanced athletes, I would suggest aiming for a surplus that gets you about 0.5 to 1% of body weight gain per month. Now, there are a couple of reasons why beginners should bulk at a faster rate. First of all, it's much easier for beginners to gain muscle in general. The total amount of muscle that you're able to put on is much larger, so you want a bigger surplus to make sure you capture all of those gains. The second reason is that beginners are not going to be able to target a specific calorie surplus as accurately as a more advanced athlete. Now, for the intermediate to advanced example, taking our 200-pound guy, 0.5 to 1% would be 1 to 2 pounds per month. More advanced athletes are going to be gaining muscle at a much slower rate. So it doesn't make sense to be putting on a lot of weight because a lot of it's just going to be fat and you're going to have to cut it later. However, once you go below this 0.5% per month, it gets difficult to practically track that amount of weight gain. As you get more experience, it's going to be harder and harder to build muscle, so you want to make sure that you at least have a positive scale change over weeks. I think for most people, tracking daily averages across a week is the most practical way to actually monitor your weight gain during a bulk. Now, how about body recomposition? I think there is a role for body recomposition, but it's mainly going to be for beginners or someone who's already on the upper end of their body fat percentage range and doesn't want to put on more fat. This applies more to people who are more experienced, but body recomposition tends to give you a slower rate of muscle gain than if you're actually in a surplus. That's all for now, guys. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit like and leave me a comment below. I'm really good about answering every single one of my comments, so you'll definitely hear back from me. In particular, how quickly do you aim to gain weight when you're bulking? Let me know below. Comment of the week is from S. Lee on my last video. I've been getting a lot of requests for coaching and training advice, and I do have a very limited amount of time, unfortunately. But as I just said, I reply to all of my comments, so it's a good loophole to get a hold of me. Now I know a lot of you are interested in body recomposition, so check out my video on how to build muscle and lose fat at the same time. Body recomposition only really works for certain groups of people, so in this video I discuss who is eligible for body recomposition and how to do it step by step. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and make sure you turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of my videos. See you next time.